Good evening and welcome to the Intercept Live. It's somewhat of a takeover. I am your host, Benjamin Dixon. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation that we began several weeks ago. Tonight, I will be joined by Professor Glaude. He's a professor of political science at Princeton University. And we're going to discuss some of the pressing issues of the day, particularly focusing on police violence, Black Lives Matter, and the recent revelation of charges not being filed by the federal government, by the Justice Department in the case of Michael Slager. We also are going to cover later on in this episode the health care debate, the health care bill that was passed by the House of Representatives on today. We want to discuss that. And finally, we also are going to discuss this executive order, this religious liberty freedom order from President Donald Trump. All of that coming up. But first, our discussion with Professor Glaude. First, I want to thank you, Professor Glaude, for joining me on the Intercept Live today. How are you today, sir?
I'm really good. I really appreciate, always enjoy having a conversation with you. And by the way, I'm not a professor of political science. I'm a professor of religion and African-American studies.
That's right.
I just like to talk about politics.
Yeah, and as I said it, as soon as it came out of my mouth, I realized, you know what, he's not in the field of political science. I'm so accustomed to talking to political science professors, but then even when you and I discuss, we've yet to have a conversation about religion and your actual field of study. But every time we discuss and have a conversation, we always have to discuss either some tragic news or things that are happening in the world around us, particularly in politics.
Right.
And so I wanted to give you, I wanted to hear from you first. There's so many topics happening right now, so many issues happening right now, from Michael Slager and Walter Scott, and also with the Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and even now with the tragic killing of 15-year-old Jordan Edwards. I mean, it's so unfortunate, but it seems to be true that once one case happens, once one thing happens, it seems to come over and over and over again. What are you feeling this week with all of these issues that are happening all at once?
Well, it lets us know that, the policing regime that defined the last couple of years of President Obama's term is still operative. It's still affecting the life chances of our young folk, life chances of people of color, Black people in particular, all throughout the country. So you can't imagine, for example, a police officer in the suburbs of Dallas using a rifle to shoot in the car of a kid full of white kids. And the fact that Jordan Edwards was shot in the head because of, I think, just some operating assumptions about Black folk. And then for the police officer to lie, and then to be discovered lying and only get fired as opposed to being arrested. Right. And then when you combine that with what is the Department of Justice's refusal to indict and proceed with attempting to prosecute the police officers who killed Alton Sterling, it gives us a sense, an indication, Brother Benjamin, that we have a lot of work to do, that we must continue to bring pressure to bear if we're going to change the policing regime in this country. But we need to understand that work will have to happen under different conditions.
Absolutely. And in the case of Jordan Edwards, the 15-year-old, he's being described by his family as an honor student, beloved by his school. The officer who has been identified in fire, Roy Oliver, has been with the police department since 2001. And you're right. One of the things that jumped out first to me in this issue, Professor, is the fact that he felt so comfortable to falsify this police report, even in the presence of a dash cam or a body cam in this case. That speaks to me to the culture, a level of comfort, willing to take that chance to falsify this report, knowing that we will see, or at least some officials will see, the video that contradicts what he said, ultimately leading to the death of a 15-year-old child. What does that say about the culture in terms that they're just comfortable in this kind of situation?
Well, it says that they don't expect to be held accountable. They don't expect to be held responsible, that they can engage in the use of force and the wanton breaking the law at any time they want to. They can treat American citizens in any way they want to, and they could feel that they will not be held accountable, that they are in fact not protectors of us, but can be protected in their own lawlessness. And I think it's part of the effect of all of the mass movement that we had over the last few years, that the police chief came out so quickly.
Yeah.
Once the tape was revealed, and fired the officer. But it seems to me that he should be arrested, because we have ample evidence and we have a dead child. Yeah. And this is part of the issue that we have to address. And it seems to me.
Speaking of the Chief of Police Haber, he said on Monday, he said that he unintentionally and incorrectly said the vehicle was backing down the road. And according to the video, the vehicle was moving forward as the officer approached. After reviewing the video, I do not believe that the shooting met our core values. So not only was the police officer willing to falsify this, but the police chief came out very quickly to confirm and to co-sign what the police officer said, and he had to subsequently backtrack from that. But you said something that's very key here. He violated the department's procedures enough to get fired. Where is that threshold then for him to get arrested? Because if he violated procedures enough to get fired, surely now he should be at least vulnerable to some type of charge.
Right, especially since we have a dead child.
Yeah.
Right, and this is really important, Benjamin. I mean, it's one thing for us to talk about the fact that Jordan Edwards was a great kid, that he excelled in school, that everyone thought of him as a good citizen of the community, that he was a part of a very tight-knit family. Yeah. It's one thing to kind of describe him in that way, but if Jordan Edwards was not those things, right? If he had a juvenile record, if he was a kid that was prone to be in trouble, the fact that the police officer broke every rule, the fact that the police officer lied, the fact that the police officer took his life, it still obtains. Yeah. So it's not a matter of us focusing on whether or not the kid was good or not. It's a matter of us focusing our attention on the fact that you have a police officer who has the legitimate right to use deadly force, right? Just engaged in a wanton act of murder, in my view. And we need to call it for what it is. But it's going to be very difficult to do that under the circumstances of a DOJ who's run by Jeff Sessions, I think, who is in so many ways a person that I would describe as being deeply, profoundly racist, and someone who's trying to backtrack on all of the agreements that were made with police departments found to have deep-seated biases, deep-seated problems in their training. And for him to pull back on these notions, on these agreements, and you see the refusal, right, to indict the cops, the police officers who killed Alton Sterling. Right. We have the conditions for the continuation of mass movement, of mass pressure, because if not, we're going to continue to see what we've just witnessed and participate in this haunting ritual of grieving over the death of another loved one in public.
And speaking of Alton Sterling, out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the Justice Department announced this week that they are not pressing charges. They haven't found sufficient evidence to press a civil rights violation against the two police officers involved in that shooting. And ironically, immediately after I got that notification, I got a notification saying that the Justice Department was going to charge the activist from Code Pink who interrupted Jeff Sessions' confirmation hearings. And so we have this stark contrast of priorities here in the United States, where we're now cracking down, even if it's in the purview of discretion, they're cracking down on dissent. But then we have this gaping hole when it comes to Black lives and police brutality, where we are not addressing the fundamental issue. It seems as though, Professor, the hurdle is too high, or it's just insurmountable in terms of a civil rights violation from the Justice Department. So what do we do now? I mean, if we can't get justice from the federal government, historically we've always had problems getting justice from the state government. What do we do as a community and as a nation?
Well, I think we just got to continue to bring pressure to bear. We have to understand the deep-seated problems in the criminal justice system, and understand that those problems are not going to be resolved by the criminal justice system as it is. So even though we have these extraordinarily horrific instances, and we have to use the law as our channel to address these extraordinarily horrible incidences. We can't go in with the understanding that the criminal justice system, that the law will resolve the matter. We have to. I think we need to have a bigger and more comprehensive understanding of the nature of transformation that needs to happen. It often puzzles me when we think that appeal to the law will resolve the fundamental bias in the law. I think we need to be a little bit more careful there. It's like saying that incarcerating people more, throwing more people in jail will solve the problem, when in fact I think the fact of incarceration itself is problematic. So I think we need to be really, really careful as we try to hold these police officers accountable, as we try to hold Jeff Sessions accountable, that we also offer a systemic critique of how the law functions on behalf of the property class, how the law functions on behalf to maintain the status quo, and how we have to begin to think carefully about how the very notion of criminal justice in this country allows for and perpetuates deep-seated inequalities that sustain those inequalities in this place.
Yeah, you're hitting on something there that strikes to the core of the issue. From my vantage point, it's a systemic level problem that we're facing.
Right.
And I wanted to get your feedback on the case of Walter Scott and Michael Slager, particularly with this undue fear, or this level of fear that is used as a justification in so many cases. The officer feared for his life. The officer feared this person. The officer thought this guy was a bad guy. So many different cases where we hear this type of language justifying their actions based on fear. But even historically, that fear is a part of the system, right? They've utilized fear and the vilification of blackness to justify a certain level of treatment of African Americans. So if on one hand, Professor, we're addressing this systemically, what about those intangible things? What about that undue fear that is permeates the policing agencies?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fear that not only permeates the policing agency, it's a fear that permeates the legislative branch. It's a fear that permeates the executive branch at the state, local, county, and at the national level. So, and it's a fear that goes all the way back to slavery, right? It's a fear that's evidenced in Thomas Jefferson's notes when he's afraid of divine retribution for the sin of slavery, the fear of Toussaint L'Ouverture and Dessalines, the fear of black rage and black revenge. It gets translated into a fear of black criminality. We're all walking bigger Thomases, as it were, as if we were all kind of prone to criminal behavior, whether it's because we grow up in a culture of pathology or because we're by nature criminal. And these kinds of assumptions and stereotypes inform the very ways in which police, whether they're black or white or brown, right, how they police our communities. And it becomes very interesting with the Slager case and the Michael Slager, Walter Scott case. I'm really interested to see the nature of the plea deal.
Yeah.
I want to see what kind of time this guy gets, because he in some ways he's pleaded guilty to violating the civil rights of Walter Scott. The trial was hung, and I want to see how much time the judge gives him. And I think this is where we will begin to see very clearly the blatant hypocrisy at the heart of the criminal justice system. And in order for us to uproot the fears, in order for us to change the systemic problems, we're going to have to call attention to it. We're going to have to call attention to it when it evidences itself. And we should say this very clearly. All these police officers who are talking about they're afraid of a 12-year-old Tamir Rice, they're afraid of Walter Scott, they're afraid of Jonathan, they were afraid for their lives, turn out in most instances that they're lying. Then you have to ask yourself, what the hell are you doing being a police officer if you're that afraid?
Come on, man. Yeah.
I mean, what the hell are you doing? And then we're going to give you a gun?
Absolutely.
You're going to have the opportunity to engage in the legitimate use of deadly force, then you don't need to be a police officer if you're that afraid. And so I think it's important for us to kind of just simply, speak the truth. Just tell it like it is in these moments, you know?
Yeah. You spoke volumes there, you know, because that's just one of the first questions I always ask is, if you're that afraid, why are you a police officer? Because you're going to be constantly put in situations where you have to make judgment calls, snap calls based on snap judgment based on your worldview, based on your experience, and based on the level of fear. If you roll into a scene and you see a 12-year-old boy and your first instinct is to be afraid of them, then to me, Professor, you're not qualified to be a police officer in the United States of America. But we see this time and time and again. We put guns in the hands of men and women who have this level of fear, these preconceived notions, and they take it directly into the job. So speak to us on how do we strategically change this? What do we target? What do we address when we protest, when we go to the city council, when we speak to our mayor? What do we say to affect that type of change?
Well, the one thing we need to do is we need to make sure we have district attorneys who will prosecute these cops. Yeah. Right. We need to make sure that there's a level of accountability. That's to say that if you have the authority to utilize deadly force, if you have that authority and it is revealed that you have broken the law in the exercise of that force, then there's a special set of rules that apply to you in terms of prosecution. Mm-hmm. Right? We need police officers to be very clear about the consequences of their actions. Right. And that, I think, starts at the level of who will bring charges, who will indict them. And this, again, is not me having undue faith in the criminal justice system. It's just me saying that if we're going to try to make an intervention at the level of the immediacy of our interface with police officers, we need to have DAs who are there ready to bring the stick down, to bring the hammer down on these police officers who behave in such a way. And then we also need to be very create those kinds of mechanisms to make police precincts transparent. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about all the things that we've learned. We've learned about the emails in the San Francisco Police Department, all the racist emails there. We've witnessed a man just coming home from work and a police officer coming up to him and grabbing him by the neck and body slamming. And for what? We don't know. We've seen them do that to children. Just recently, the video footage that's gone viral of a 14-year-old, Benjamin, a 14-year-old sitting in a chair. We don't know what he did prior to, but he was just sitting in the chair. And a grown man comes into the office, puts him in a chokehold, tries to walk him away from the camera, body slams him, knocks his teeth out, and then another grown white man puts his hand on his head. They handcuff him and then lift him up by his arms. It's a 14-year-old, a child. And the question is, how is it that as a country, white, black, brown, yellow, all of us, how is it that we're not outraged? Yeah. The reason is because we presume that these black children, right, are by definition, or black people or black adults are by definition criminal. And so we have to attack it at the level of culture as well. So by way of summary, we got to have DAs who are willing to prosecute. We got to be transparent about the practices of police precincts. And we have to, in some ways, speak to the deep-seated cultural logics of how black men and women are represented in popular culture as by definition criminal, as by definition dangerous. Whether you have a suit on or whether your pants are sagging, you are subject to this kind of violence. It just varies to degree. And frequency.
There's an article in the Intercept, or on the Intercept's website today, that discusses some of the things that you mentioned by Alice Sperry. Killer cop conviction is an exception, and don't expect justice from Sessions Department of Justice. And I think you hit it on the head in terms of what this plea deal is actually going to bear out with Michael Slager. But in so many cases, Professor, we don't get justice. We're just on the 25-year anniversary of the LA riots with Rodney King. And from that point, you know, at least in my lifetime, that was a flashpoint to realize how unjust this justice system can actually can be. Where do we go for justice? I mean, and I know that sounds like a big question, but for people who are a lofty question rather, but for people who are frustrated, if we can't get justice from our Department of Justice, whether it's Trump's Department of Justice or Obama's, what do we do?
Absolutely. Well, I think what we have to do, and this is really important, Benjamin, we have to understand that the quest for just policing, that the arguments around abolition of prisons, that we have to link this up with a broader progressive vision. And this is why it's so important in this moment of political turmoil that progressive voices out there understand the inextricable connection between economic realities and racial realities, to understand the deep-seated ties, right, between economic inequalities and racial inequalities. Not to talk about these things as if they're separate, but to understand that a real, genuine progressive vision in this country has to finally has to finally how can we say, bridge the chasm between workers and race, and begin to talk about this, right, as intimately linked. Otherwise, we will find ourselves, as James Baldwin said, right? James Baldwin said in, I think, Uses of the Blues, he said, America is like a monstrous minstrel show. The same old songs, the same old dance, the same old jokes. So if we have a progressive voice that's not speaking to the ways in which race overdetermines how class is experienced in this country, if we don't have a progressive voice doing that, then that progressive voice will only end up reproducing a society where black men and boys, black women and girls will be subject to unjust violence, to horrible violence, and we will find ourselves over and over again mourning our dead in public while white liberal sentimentality says, oh, look how bad it is for them, and nothing changes. Nothing changes. So we need a progressive vision around race and the economy, both together, and that will speak to the fundamentals of policing and the fundamentals of justice in this country.
Professor, I want to hold that conversation there and leave your last word where it stands. But in the middle of this conversation, I realized that you and I actually do have an opportunity for the first time to talk about religion between the two of us because of this religious executive order, two parts, right? The executive order that conservative Christians wanted to get today, and the executive order that they actually got. So for those in the audience who may not have watched the news, there was an executive order signed by President Trump on today that essentially loosens the enforcement of the Johnson Amendment, which separates the church's ability to endorse political parties or to be outright political. Professor, I just have to know, what do you think about that piece of that executive order, rather?
Well, it's part of President Trump delivering for the white evangelicals who voted for him at 81%. He's already done it with Judge Gorsuch, and now he's doing it with this executive order. I think many of the white Christian evangelicals were trying to get him to embrace the kind of religious freedom language that came out of Mississippi and Georgia. But he hasn't quite gone that far. But what we see is an attempt to consolidate political power, right, by in some ways blurring the lines of church and state, that will enable a certain kind of Christian voice. Remember, a certain kind of Christian voice to enter the body politic. And this is really important because we know that white Christian evangelicals are witnessing a substantive, they flatlined in terms of their growth. That we know that their numbers that their trend lines are not upward, that in fact we see their numbers are going to shrink. They're standing still right now, but young people are beginning to leave, that in some ways the heyday of the Christian right is in the past. And so I think this is part of this last ditched effort. Much of what the Trump presidency is about, and this is just one example of it, is this last-ditch effort to hold on, right, to power, to insinuate their vision of the world into the order of things. because they know their world is dying. They know it's dying.
Yeah.
And so this is just the latest example of it, brother. It's just the latest example.
Let me drill down on something that you identified right away. It's a certain type of Christian voice. And Donald Trump, in his comments, he said that I know that you're going to say good things, right? He has no problem with this because he knows that that audience is going to say good things. What do you think Trump and the IRS, who's charged with enforcing this, what do you think they're going to do when a Jeremiah Wright comes around the corner and says the chickens are coming home to roost, and not God bless America, but goddamn America? Do you think they're going to be able to hold on to this this executive order, or do you think they'll quickly retreat?
Brother, we know these hypocrites. You know, we know these people are blatant hypocrites. They don't care. They will tell you one thing, and it applies to one group of people, and the very same principle, when applied to another group of people, just simply doesn't hold. We've seen this from Mitch McConnell. We've seen it from Paul Ryan. We've seen it from the Department of Justice. We've seen it in relation to how they will prosecute protesters and how they won't prosecute police officers who are murderers. So this is not unusual. We see it, you know, in the USA Today. They're talking about President Obama may lose his pension. Congress may come after his pension because he gave a speech for $400,000 at Wall Street. Now, I disagree. I'm critical of President Obama delivering that speech at Wall Street. It actually reveals his stripes. It shows who he actually is. But the idea that Jason Chaffetz is now going to go after him when only two other presidents, I think it was Carter and Truman, didn't do what all the other presidents including Obama, have done and is doing, just shows you the blatant hypocrisy. So if you hear Jeremiah Wright, or you hear a progressive pastor, Otis Moss III, you hear Freddie K. Haynes, you hear folks coming out bringing the full power of a prophetic church witness, Christian witness, to bear on social issues, they're going to cry church and state immediately. They're going to try to take away their tax exempt status. We know it. Absolutely. They're hypocrites.
Absolutely.
There's no fundamental principle. This is the fundamental principle. The principle is, how do they maintain control of power? Right. That's it. Nothing else matters. And when we understand that Machiavellian orientation, then we know who we're dealing with. And we need to stop pretending that it's otherwise. And actually, there's nothing else to add to that. Professor Glaude, chair of the Center for African American Studies and the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. I figured since I didn't get it right the first time, I would get it in its totality the second time around. Thanks so much for joining me. We definitely want to have you back anytime that you're available. Always, always. And take care of yourself and keep doing this work, Doc. Absolutely will.
Thanks so much. If you want to weigh in on the discussion, you could do so right in the comment section. Give us your feedback, and we'll bring your comment on the screen, and we'll discuss it. You can also leave us a voicemail, 857-600-0518. Just fascinated with, always fascinated with Professor Glaude's perspective and vantage point, particularly on race and religion issues. So a couple comments that are coming up in our chat. I want to bring those up on the screen as we get them so that we can give you feedback. This is an ongoing conversation, so we want to hear from you. 857-600-0518 if you have anything that you want to say. We actually have a voicemail that I think I have not had a chance to hear this voicemail, but if I'm not mistaken, this is actually something that bears commenting on. Let's take a listen to it.
Yeah, hi, Benjamin. This is Eric calling from Santa Barbara. Just calling to give you a heads up on this young kid named Frederick Douglass. He's predicted to do big things going forward, so let's make sure we keep an eye on him. You know, Benjamin, we are more and more negligent as a country, as a nation, the longer we allow this man to remain in power as president. You know, while we watch his buffoonery and look at his distractions, he has a whole administration filled with inept, incompetent, and unqualified people that are doing much damage to this country. And by the time we realize exactly what they've all done, it's going to be too late. Look, guys like you and I and your audience, we recognize what's going on. But when Trump tells us that Andrew Jackson was really mad about the Civil War.
Yeah.
And, I mean, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
What do you and I do with that? His listeners and the people that see him and hear him say that are going to say, yeah, he was mad, and Trump's just like Andrew Jackson.
Yeah. I think that's actually a great question to transition into our next conversation about health care. One of the things that amazes me the most about politics, particularly Donald Trump as a politician, is the ability to say anything and have someone believe them. And we see that today with the health care conversation, the American Health Care Act that was passed by the House of Representatives on a very close margin, 217 in favor, 214 voted against. All of the House Democrats voted against it, along with 20 House Republicans voted against it, and it just barely passed. You would have thought that they passed a bill that is not only the best thing that America has ever done, but that is going to specifically help Americans in the realm of health care. With the language that came from Donald Trump, with the language that came from Speaker Ryan, with the language that came from the House Majority Leader McCarthy, you really would believe that they passed something that is specifically aimed at helping people. In fact, we have a couple of tweets here from Paul Ryan and from the House Majority Leader that says just about as much. On your screen now, if you look at it, Paul Ryan said about this health care bill, he said it's verified that the MacArthur Amendment strengthens the AHCA, protects people with pre-existing conditions. And this, to me, speaks to not only the power of political spin, but also speaks to the willingness of our political leaders to outright deceive us. And I know most outlets don't want to use the word lie, but this is a pure deception. And what was passed today was a bill that, according to the Congressional Budget Office, before the amendment was added, was going to cost 24 million Americans access to health care. 24 million fewer Americans will be able to access health care based on the bill that went before the MacArthur Amendment. I put emphasis on that because as of today, we do not have a CBO score for the current bill that was just passed by the House of Representatives. So we honestly don't know how hard or how badly Americans are going to be hurt by this bill. But they gathered in the Rose Garden, they gathered around the president, and they celebrated as though they had done America the greatest benefit possible. The reality of it is that if we drill down in the reasons, why would they push a bill that they spent less than 8 weeks planning, working on? Why would they push a bill that has not been scored by the Congressional Budget Office? And when it was scored by the Congressional Budget Office, clearly demonstrated that it was going to hurt more Americans than it was going to help. Why would they push a bill that is unpopular, extremely unpopular, to try to repeal a bill, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which is gaining in popularity? Every day someone learns something new about the ACA. Why would they do this? It is because of the unfettered ego of our president, President Donald Trump. More than anything else, he wanted to get a win. He was desperate for any legislative win that he was going to push this through, even though they failed previously. Even though it failed in a spectacular fashion, Donald Trump was not going to let go until he got a legislative win, and not just any legislative win, mind you, a legislative win that would begin to unravel President Obama's legacy. This is what Donald Trump wants more than anything else. In addition to that, the House Republicans, led by Paul Ryan, they have a separate agenda from Donald Trump. The House Republicans have an agenda not only of repealing and attempting to replace Obamacare, but they have a vested interest in passing this legislation because they wanted to get it done before they went home. They are getting ready to go on an 11-day recess. And on that 11-day recess, it's very possible that they would have to face town halls. They would have to face their constituents. And if these legislators got a chance to go home and have to face an angry town hall, then it's very likely that they would never have voted for this legislation. And so they rushed and did everything they could to get it through sooner than later. Not only do they have a vested interest in getting it done quickly, but they have a vested interest in the amount of tax dollars that are going to be cut, the tax savings for the wealthiest in America. Keep this in mind. At the expense of the elderly, at the expense of special needs students, according to the New York Times, at the expense of the poorest among us, inside of this legislation is a tax break. And so, of course, this fits the worldview of someone like Paul Ryan, because above anything else, the most important thing for him is to serve the wealthiest of the wealthy in America. But that's what you already know. What troubles me the most is their willingness to look us in the face and tell us that up is down and down is up, what's good is bad and what's bad is good. They're willing to deceive us without any hesitation and without any reservation. And so Paul Ryan's claim that the MacArthur bill is actually designed to help with pre-existing conditions, the reality of the MacArthur Amendment actually exposes people with pre-existing conditions to the whims of the individual state. And the state now has the ability to decide what benefits are going to be offered, what health benefits are going to be priority, what health benefits are going to be mandatory. The state now gets to determine it for itself. So not only are the elderly vulnerable, but people with pre-existing conditions are vulnerable, all while our leadership yells at us and tells us that they're doing us a favor. A tweet from House Majority Leader McCarthy went out today, and he said the AHCA will cover those with pre-existing conditions while decreasing the cost of health care overall. I believe that this is probably the most deceptive, because there is a waiver that can be received by states that will give insurers the ability to evaluate someone based on pre-existing conditions if they're able to lower premiums or if they're able to broaden the pool. So where the House Majority Leader is saying that you're going to be able to do both, and the reality of it is it's either or. You're going to be exposed if you have a pre-existing condition, but this does not stop them from celebrating. This does not stop them from telling you that it's good. It does not stop them from telling you that it's a repeal, when in actuality it is not a repeal. It is just an attempt to give tax breaks at the expense of the most vulnerable in our society. And this is where we are. In fact, this is where we have always been. We have always been in a place where politicians have looked us in the face and said one thing while doing something entirely different. The American Association of Medical Colleges put out a statement in regards to the bill that was passed today. They said the most recent amendment does not protect access to affordable coverage for these individuals. As drafted, the AHCA would allow states to waive current protections for individuals with pre-existing conditions who have a gap in coverage, leaving them vulnerable to insurers who may charge higher premiums based on their more fragile health status. And this is just the first half of their statement, because in addition to the MacArthur Amendment is another amendment that attempted to pull back in the moderate Republicans. The moderate Republicans who were afraid of what the House Republicans were going to do. And so the moderate Republicans, they threw in $8 billion in attempt to help those with pre-existing conditions or those who would be exposed to high-risk pools. And of that particular amendment, this is what the American Association of Medical Colleges had to say. They said the amendment appears to offer little relief for these skyrocketing costs for the sick. What relief it would provide is impossible for any patient or family to predict. And so here we are on the first leg of this attempt to repeal Obamacare that is really tied to nothing more than the desire to cut taxes and the desire to give our president a win that he so desperately wants. And it only cost us the security that we had, or that we were building with the Affordable Care Act. This is something that's key, and I think people miss this. The Affordable Care Act was not perfect. There is no perfect legislation, but the Affordable Care Act was not perfect. But the Republicans were never interested in making it any better. They were interested in undermining it at every possible turn. They were interested, even if it cost lives, even if it cost even if it costs people to pay more, even if it costs people to live in fear because of what they will no longer be able to get, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that they were able to give President Trump the victory that he so desperately needed, and for them to appear that the last 7 years of them yelling that we're going to repeal and replace were not utterly wasted. In reality, we found out very quickly that the Republicans are very capable of being in the opposition, but they're not quite capable of actually governing. And in the absence of an administration that knows what it has to do or knows what to do or knows how to do it, and in the absence of a House of Representatives that is actually capable of leading and governing, what we have been left with are politicians who will gather together in the Rose Garden and smile and laugh and discuss how beautiful this legislation is, when in reality it is going to hurt at a minimum 24 million Americans. And we may wake up tomorrow morning and find out, because of the MacArthur Amendment, it will hurt so many more. You cannot laugh and tell me, smile in my face and tell me that everything is going to be okay when we have the ability to look at what you're doing. We have the ability to look at the legislation, and despite your tweets, despite your sound bites, despite your talking points, we have the ability to look at it and say, what you are doing to America, Donald Trump, is hurting Americans for the sake of your ego. That's all we have for you tonight. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Intercept Live. Thanks to Professor Glaude for joining us, and thanks to the entire team at the Intercept. We will see you next time. Have a good night.